I left right after I finished high school. So the first half of my time in Iran was under regime of Shah. The second half was under the Islamic Republic regime. Then I spent about half a year in Italy, and then I came to Los Angeles, and I've lived in LA since that time. So because I've had a lot of time, I've had the chance to sample all the big universities in LA. I got my bachelor's in Cal State Northridge, master's and PhD at USC, did a postdoc at Caltech, and got a job at UCLA. Here I'm showing the evolution of my scientific interest over the years in the bottom, and my career interest in the top. You know, growing up in Iran during the revolution was really a privilege in some sense. It was a very challenging time. It had its challenges. It was very tumultuous because of the war and the revolution and all the things that went with that. But it was also extremely intellectually stimulating. So as a child, I got exposed to a lot of stimulating debates, thinkers, intellectuals. So I got exposed to a lot of different philosophers. And I got very interested already as a child in philosophy. I got interested in materialism, idealism, consciousness. And in middle school, I got interested in math and sciences. In high school, I majored in math and physics. And my favorite subject was what they called Riyaziyat Jadid. That was actually a computer theory. And also reading science magazines, I got very interested in artificial intelligence. Towards the end of high school, the war with Iraq intensified, and there were a lot of casualties, and there was a shortage of medical supplies, medical staff. So I felt that, you know, the country needed doctors much more than scientists. So I started studying biology on my own and was planning on going to medical school. But then when I arrived in LA, I remember one day I was on a bus, riding on a bus, and it dawned on me that there's no shortage of doctors here. If anything, there may be a surplus of doctors here. So I felt that, you know, somewhat liberated. I felt I could pursue my passion. So I studied computer science in college and focused on AI. And that got me interested in brain science. And in grad school, I got interested in vision and learning. I did my PhD work on a computational model of how intermediate object representations develop in early infancy. And towards the end, I got interested in testing the predictions of the model. So I went to Caltech and tried to do empirical research on infants, testing some of these predictions, and learned the hard way in the first year that infant research was not my cup of tea. And I got interested in auditory visual perception instead in adults. And I pursued that as I got my job. I focused primarily on multisensory perception. That got me interested in multisensory learning and then memory, and then later also perceptual pleasure and preference. And on the top, I'm showing my career interests. As a child, I was a true nerd. I'm happy I didn't grow up here. I think I would have been bullied very much here. So I was always reading or writing. So I wanted to become a teacher or a writer when I grew up. But in middle school or high school, I got interested in science, wanted to become a scientist. And now this continued as I finished my studies. And what I found myself doing is that in addition to research, I'm also doing a lot of teaching and writing. And I feel that I made a full circle in my career interests and also in scientific interests. And I find this interesting because it seems like some of our interests may become dormant for a while, but they don't really disappear, and they may make a comeback. because I'm going to talk a lot about multisensory processing and cross-modal interactions, I thought I'd start with a demo of what these kinds of interactions look like or can look like. And then I'm going to start talking about the computational modeling work we've been doing that tries to gain insight into the principles that govern these interactions. And then I will talk a little bit about another very active line of research in the lab, which is cross-modal interactions in learning and memory. And I squeezed in another few slides at the end, talking about some of our more recent research on perceptual pleasure, but most probably I won't have time to get to that. So here's the demo. The red dot on the screen is the fixation point. So please keep your eyes fixated on that. And then I'm going to show a visual stimulus in the lower left of the screen and one on the lower right part of the screen. And while you keep your eyes fixated on the red dot, please pay attention and see if you notice a difference between these two stimuli. So here we go. Oh, great. It didn't show up the stimulus. Okay, so I'll have to repeat this because Zoom is not cooperating. So let's give it one more try. So the red is a fixation point. Here we go. Okay, that was one stimulus. Now the other one. Okay, so I hope it worked this time for you. If you notice any difference between these two stimuli, please raise your hand.
So we do not see the stimuli, at least I do not see.
Oh, you didn't see this, the black disc?
No, we just heard the noise.
Oh, really? You didn't see the oh, okay. So yeah, I'm sorry it didn't work. I tried twice.
It's fine, yeah.
Yeah. So the demo actually, this demo is also on our website. So if you go to my website, to the demo page, you can see this. And basically what this is that if we present one flash together with two beeps, people perceive two flashes. So this, when we found this illusion in year 2000, at that time it was believed that vision is the dominant sensory modality. And so this illusion for the first time showed that vision is not always dominant, and even visual modality, visual perception can be radically and qualitatively be changed by information from other modalities. So in the real world, we are constantly bombarded with sensory stimuli. We don't have to be walking in a noisy street in Kyoto or Tokyo. Even if we are having a quiet dinner at home with our family, the brain processes at any given moment tens of sensory stimuli. For example, tactile stimuli from the food we are eating, the utensils we are holding, the clothes we're wearing, the chair we're sitting on, olfactory signals from the food on the table and people around us, flavor signals from the food, auditory signals from the sound of chewing or the utensils or people talking, music in the background, visual signals from all the people and objects around us. And all of these this is just like a melange of electrical signals in the brain, and these signals don't come labeled with what caused them. So it's the job of the brain to figure that out, to discover which of these signals was caused by which object outside in the world. And this is a problem I refer to as causal inference, and it's computationally intractable. So we really don't know how the brain does it, but the brain does a really good job at it. So to gain insight into how this problem is solved by the brain, we have reduced it to the most simplistic toy kind of scenario where there are only two signals available. But even in this most simplistic scenario, the problem of causal inference persists. The brain has to determine whether the auditory and visual stimuli, the two signals, were caused by the same object or by independent objects. And once the brain brain does that, makes an inference about the causal scenario, then if it's inferred that it was the same object that caused both signals, then the brain has to solve another problem, which is sensory integration. And the reason this is a problem is because even when the signals are caused by the same object, that doesn't mean that they're going to be consistent. In fact, almost always there's inconsistency and discrepancy between the sensory signals. And the reason for that is that they are processed in different pathways and they're corrupted by independent noise processes. There's also noise in the environment. So there's always the disagreement, and the perceptual system has to resolve this disagreement in order to come up with the best estimate of what is the object outside in the world. So we propose a Bayesian model that can account for both of these problems in a coherent fashion. And it's a competitive prior model, meaning that there are two causal structures or priors that compete, the common cause scenario and the independent causes scenario. They compete to explain the sensory data. And the probability of each of these causal structures is calculated using Bayes' rule. And once that's calculated, then the best estimate of what is the object or the, the perceptual variable, for example, where is the sound coming from, or what is the identity of the speech, what this person is saying. The optimal estimate happens to be a weighted average of two other optimal estimates. The optimal estimate given a common cause and optimal estimate given independent causes. Each of these are weighted by the probability of the respective causal structure. The idea of perception as probabilistic inference is not new. It goes way back to 11th century when a scientist by the name Al-Haytham, known as Al-Hazan here in the West, referred to it as unnoticed judgment. And by the way, this scientist is an incredible scientist that I am ashamed to say that I did not know about until several years ago. And it's in some sense a sad commentary on our educational system. He is credited with inventing the scientific method. So he's known also as the first scientist. He has done pioneering work in a number of other disciplines. He was prolific, and he came from an area that is now considered Iraq, lived most of his life in Egypt under house arrest, an amazing person. And then in the 19th century, von Helmholtz basically proposed something similar. He referred to it as unconscious inference. And not surprisingly, most papers give the credit to von Helmholtz instead of Al-Haytham. And the idea of comparative prior Bayesian inference is not novel either. It goes back to a couple of studies by vision scientists that propose something like that as models of visual tasks like slant perception or motion perception. But when we proposed this model, we had no idea that this model is mathematically equivalent to these earlier models. So can this model account for multisensory phenomenon? The model was developed to account for the sound-induced flash illusion that I tried to show you earlier. And it accounted for that very well. But over the years, we have tested it systematically in a number of different paradigms and tasks. And take-home message is that it accounts very well for all of these things. And these tasks span a number of different sensory modalities, a number of different perceptual tasks, from spatial processing to temporal processing, perception of objects in the world, to perception of the body and self-body ownership, and even a phenomena involving weight perception that was considered to be anti-Bayesian. It turns out to be actually very well explained by this model. So we were really excited about this because we felt that, we stumbled upon something that seems to be a unifying account of multisensory perception in general. But then as more people adopted the model and it got tested in other tasks and we looked into the literature, we noticed that actually the scope of the model is not limited to multisensory perception. We saw that the same kind of computation has accounted for unisensory perceptual tasks, sensory motor tasks, and a number of things, navigation, etc. And in this paper that is right now under review, we argue that all of these models are instances of Bayesian causal inference theory. And the theory can be summarized, the core computation of the theory can be summarized as follows. There is competition between priors or causal structures. And then based on that inference, there is an estimation of hidden variables. Hidden variables are variables that we don't have direct access to. So those variables get estimated based on this inference about the causal structure, and all of these computations are Bayesian. They use Bayes' rule. So this has been tested at all three levels of analysis, Mars levels of analysis. And here I show a slide that summarizes the computational studies where the predictions of the model was compared with behavioral data in different tasks, and they showed that they're consistent, and the model accounts for the data very well, and in some cases they show that it accounts for the data better than other models. Each of these boxes is not one study; it's one group of studies, one domain of brain function. And each of these numbers here represent one paper that was published in that domain. So in the review paper we have on the review, we go over more than 80 papers, 80 studies that have shown the model accounts for a range of tasks from sensation to action. And some other studies have tried to shed light on the representations and algorithms that may be involved in this kind of computation. We showed that the likelihoods and priors are encoded independently and combined using Bayes' rule. A few more recent studies have suggested that the processing starts with these unisensory estimates that then lead to the integration estimate and the segregation estimate, and that then get combined and lead to the final causal inference estimate. And these studies have also tried to look at where in the brain these computations happen, and they have mapped a hierarchy of areas, brain areas, starting with unisensory areas encoding the individual or unisensory estimates to posterior parietal regions encoding integration estimates, to prefrontal or anterior parietal areas encoding the final causal inference estimates. Several groups also have tried to figure out how this kind of computation can happen in the brain by proposing neural networks that can achieve the same kind of performance. And here I show two examples of these studies. They are biologically plausible. They use very simple mechanisms like long-range connectivity or opposite cells that we know already exist in the brain. So Bayesian causal inference is normative, it's parsimonious. It has made predictions that have been confirmed by empirical data. I didn't show you, but I'm happy to discuss this later on. It accounts for a diverse set of phenomena, things that appear to have nothing to do with each other, like perception of space, to perception of the body, perception of speech, interpretation of retinal displacement, eye movements, reaching, and navigation, a lot of different things that seem to have nothing to do with each other. And some studies have compared this model with other models show that it accounts better for data than alternative models. And it also accounts for counterintuitive phenomena like negative bias effect. And it has shed light on all three levels of Mars levels of analysis. And for these reasons, we argue that it's a unifying and strong neuroscience theory. So when we proposed this in 2005, 2006, people didn't take it seriously, and it didn't really get traction until several years ago when people started using it and testing it on their data. And as you can see, over the years, there have been increasing number of citations of Bayesian causal inference, and more groups are looking into different aspects of it. NSF, a few years ago, NSF sponsored my lab to develop a MATLAB toolbox of the model so that other groups can use it for teaching and research. And my former grad student, Majid Samad, led that project, and the toolbox is on GitHub for anybody who may be interested in checking it out. So if there's no questions so far, I'm gonna move on to the second part of the talk, which is about learning and memory. So I don't see any questions.
I was curious. I have one question, if you don't mind.
Sure.
I mean, regarding the implementation, the more implementational level. I mean, I have difficulty. I personally myself like the framework, but I have difficulty incorporate the implementational level with the Bayesian framework. Like, for example, I mean, at the larger scale model of the brain, you can think of, okay, this region is coding for prior, this region coding for posterior, and so on and so forth. But like in the circuit level, apart from some works of Sufi Deneb, I couldn't find many works that address the implementation level too much. I would love to hear your speculation comments on that.
That's an excellent question. And that has been the challenge. So all of these neural network models show that the outcome, the output is consistent with human behavior, which can be accounted and the Bayesian causal inference behavior. So the outputs are consistent, but figuring out what aspect of the network is capturing prior, what aspect is capturing likelihood, what aspect is capturing the perceptual decision making, all of those components, it's very difficult to map exactly what component is mapping to what computation. So I've been collaborating with Cristiano Cupini, and we are trying to get to that. So if you are interested in this, I'll be happy to talk more. So for example, and he's the right person to answer this question. So for example, he could say that, oh, these long range connectivities between these, the visual and auditory networks are implementing the prior, or this is implementing the likelihood. So he will be in a better position to address your question, but that's definitely a very important question that has not been addressed so far very well. Okay.
Dr. Shams, do you mind going over the differences between prior and likelihood?
Yeah, yeah, those are the two main components of Bayesian inference. Priors are assumptions, expectations that the brain has about the world, or if you will, a model of the world. For example, if the task is spatial localization, we may have a prior that, and actually this is what we have found, that the brain expects things to happen in the center of the visual field. So we have a bias for center in the visual domain. And likelihoods are the sensory representations, how precise the information is represented in the brain. So for example, in a spatial task, vision is more precise than hearing, so the likelihood functions are narrower, and that represents the higher precision or reliability. So in Bayesian inference, there's a competition, if you will, between priors and likelihoods. If the likelihoods are very strong, if we have very clean and strong data, then that dominates and influences overall perception. If the data is not very reliable, for example, if we're driving in a foggy day, the visual information is not very reliable, then we rely more on the priors dominate. So there's this competition that basically is the essence of Bayesian inference.
So may I ask a question?
Sure.
If you want to consider to have kind of different explanation from a dynamical system perspective, so the prior would be as initial condition. And if you have two modalities, it could be considered two dynamical systems who are integrating information, and a downstream area might cooperate to put those together. So how do you see it in a Bayesian framework, something like that, that the prior could be initial condition for a dynamical system to do this sensory integration, for example, for auditory, and another one would be to do it for visual, and somehow along the visual, the ventral stream or dorsal stream, but here would be auditory and also with the ventral stream to put it together.
That's another $64,000 question. How are priors implemented in the brain? We really don't know. I believe, and that's my gut feeling, that priors operate at multiple levels of processing, from very early on, the nature of the connectivity in the networks, to higher levels, and those like reflect cognitive or like instructions in a task, expectations that we have, depending on the environment we are. So I believe that priors operate at multiple levels of processing, from early to late, and there is some debate about this in the field, and I am very sympathetic to the view that priors, or at least some of these low-level priors, may be implemented as spontaneous activity in neuronal networks. But as you said, that perception is not the instantaneous process. Information gets accumulated over time, and there are models like Kalman filter models that try to model that, the evolution. And there's also drift diffusion models that we are also working on, a Bayesian drift diffusion model that tries to model this accumulation of data, and then the priors would be like the limits that you have to reach to make a decision, or the starting point. All of those would act as priors in the Bayesian sense. But I think the jury is out on that, how priors are implemented and how they interact with sensory information. I hope that.
I want to ask another question, but if you mind. So if you
I'm sorry, could you please just keep the questions for the end of the talk, so we can have a time, because we are running out of time right now. I would appreciate it if you keep the questions for the end.
Okay, sorry. Sure. Yeah, sorry, I should have thought of that. So I still have a lot of slides to go through. I'm happy to discuss this more at the end if there's time. The second part of my talk, so far everything I have said, things that show there is vigorous interaction between modalities, and the interactions are statistically optimal. We have shown it in my lab, many other labs have shown in other labs, so these are important, but ultimately they're not that surprising. It makes sense for the brain to use every source of information available to it to make an optimal estimate. So the second part of my talk is findings that I find most surprising in our research. And it's the finding that even when the information is available only from one sensory modality, there still seems to be interaction between modalities behind the scene. And what I mean by that is this: perception and learning modality X depends on the pre-existing relationship between modality X and modality Y in the brain. And that means that even when modality Y is not stimulated, it can still influence processing in modality X. So I'm sorry if this sounds cryptic, so this may clarify it a little bit more. We have basically found that multisensory experience influences, modifies the subsequent unisensory processing. It shapes the unisensory representations. And we have found this in a number of different paradigms, from adaptation to sensory recalibration to episodic memory and other types of memory, perceptual learning. Here I just go over a couple of examples, starting with sensory recalibration. So we have found that just a single exposure for a few milliseconds to a sound and a flash, a sound and a sight that are spatially discrepant is enough to shift the entire map of space in the auditory modality. Basically, the brain reacts instantaneously to any discrepancy between the modalities that it experiences. And the sensory recalibration has been known for a long time, and it's typically considered a very low-level process. But we have found evidence that even though we think of it as a very low-level process, it's very strongly influenced also by perception of unity, perception of a common cause. It's much stronger when the signals are perceived to belong to the same object than otherwise. We have also found interaction between modalities, very, very strong interactions in perceptual learning. Perceptual learning has been studied a lot over the last couple of decades, but always in one single sensory modality. But in the real world, most learning happens in multisensory settings. So what we did, we compared these two on a visual task. A classic perceptual learning task, which is detection and discrimination of visual motion. We trained two groups of subjects, one group with only visual stimuli and another group with visual and auditory stimuli moving in the same direction. And the data you see here is from trials where there is only visual information available, no sound. And what we found was that the group that was trained with sound learned much faster and much more than the group that was trained with visual information. So we thought this may be because of the alerting effect of sound. People were more aroused during training, so they learned better. We did another experiment where we trained the same two conditions, visual only and audiovisual congruent condition, but also a third group got trained with visual and auditory stimuli moving in the opposite direction this time. And we didn't see any facilitation for this group, which rules out the effect of attention and suggests that the integration between the two modalities is key to this kind of facilitation. And another very surprising finding here was that after the learning, after the performance plateaued, the group that was trained with congruent audiovisual stimuli, their performance in the visual only trials was the same as their performance in the audiovisual trials, the broken line. And as if the sound is there, even though there is no sound available. So we want to see if this is just a fluke or whether this is a general phenomenon. We tested another visual task, visual rhythm discrimination task, where we presented sequences of flashes and the subjects had to discriminate the sequences. We trained three groups of subjects, one group only with flashes, one group with flashes and synchronous beeps. That's the audiovisual training group. And then as control condition, we trained a third group with just beeps, no flashes. And all three groups were tested on flashes, a visual task. This is the result of the visual group. Despite extensive training, they didn't show any significant improvement. This is the audio-visual group. They showed a very robust and significant improvement already after the first session of training. And this replicated our other studies showing audio-visual facilitation of visual learning. And for the third group, we expected to get no improvement because they only got trained with sound, and this is what we got. So we were really shocked. We didn't know what to make of this. After scratching our heads a lot, we came up with two mechanisms that could potentially give rise to this kind of cross-modal facilitation, and they both involve interaction between the two modalities behind the scene. So I think I don't have time anymore to show you that, yeah, I should wrap up, right? Okay, so I'm gonna skip over this third section and basically conclude. Oops. Oh,
excuse me, do you mind going through the third section, just the results? It was just a very interesting topic, if you don't mind, like for the third section.
Oh, Shahar-Jan, do you think?
Yeah, we have some minutes for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, okay, perfect. Then I'm happy to do that. Okay, so if I show you these two pictures, I'm sure you have a preference for one over the other one, but you know, your preference is probably because of what you know about the content of these pictures. Because if you look closely, we see that perceptually they're very similar. The same colors, same shapes, same lighting. Perceptually they're very similar. So this preference is because of cognitive factors. But if I show you pictures like this, and you have a preference for one over the other one, it's probably because of perceptual factors, because they're very similar in terms of content. And if I play two pieces of music to you that you have never heard before, and you prefer one over the other one, again, it's probably because of perceptual factors, the qualities of the sound. This is called perceptual pleasure, and it has been studied primarily in the context of visual images, and there have been some studies of sounds, but it hasn't been really studied in multisensory conditions. So we wanted to check that. I wanted to see if there's anything interesting about multisensory perceptual pleasure. And before I tell you about the study, I'm going to show you a demo. And here I'm going to show you two clips of music video. And I'm going to ask you to rate how much you enjoy each of these on a scale from -100 to +100, -100 being very unpleasant, and knowing +100 is very enjoyable, 0 is neutral. Okay. So after each of the two trials, please write down your score, and then we're going to compare the two scores. So here's the first trial. Okay, so please write down your score. You probably noticed these were landscapes from LA, and now the second trial. Okay, please write down your score. So how many people gave a higher score to the first trial, first video? Please raise your hands. Okay. Okay, some but not all. Yeah, so Zoom can mess this up, sorry. Okay, how many people felt the two videos were identical? Please raise your hand. Okay, okay. So the correct answer is that the two videos were identical. The two audios were identical, but the relationship between the two was not. In the first trial, the first beat of music was aligned with the video, the cuts in the video. In the second trial, the first beat was not aligned. That was the only difference. And we have done two experiments on this. One was between subject comparison, one was within subject comparison. And the subjects invariably prefer the aligned or congruent version over misaligned version, even though they probably like you, they didn't notice the difference between the two. They were not aware of the manipulation. So that was that was it. I'm going to wrap up. Causal inference has been studied exclusively in the context of reasoning and cognition in the past. I argue that it's a bigger problem for perception because perception has to solve this problem every moment. And the Bayesian causal inference seems to be a unifying theory of multisensory perception that governs both the perception of the world and the perception of us, our bodies. And it also accounts for a number of other processing domains, and therefore we propose it as a unifying neuroscience theory. Cross-modal interactions play a role both on the scene when there are multiple signals are available at the same time, and also behind the scene, as we can see from memory and learning phenomena that show that unisensory processing is influenced both by multisensory and cross-modal prior experience. And congruency between auditory and visual stimuli is preferred even when we are not aware of it. Thank you very much.